Today we were having 3 assignment due.
I see.
And the big Java assignment.
Nobody told them you get 3 days to sleep? No? No class Monday?
We never have class on Monday.
Ah, lucky you. Okay, so we're back with hour 2. We've got MongoDB running. I just want to touch on, Jesse had a question about an application he was looking to build and asking, you know, is MongoDB as NoSQL maybe a good fit? So there's no kind of right and wrong answer when you should use a relational database, when you should use a NoSQL database. I was kind of poking around. Somewhere there's a very good article that I wanted to post. If I can find the one I was thinking of, there's some very good comparisons and there's some kind of different scenarios. So some things to think about, when would we use a relational database versus a NoSQL database? There's kind of a few questions we can ask ourselves. Number one is, do we want a flexible data model or do we want it to be rigid? And there are some organizations or some applications where the data needs to be rigid. Think about if we're writing an application for a bank, or processing financial transactions, or we're doing something for government, right? The data can't be loose. They're going to have very strict and clear rules about what the data needs to look like. In that case, a relational database probably makes a lot more sense. Part of our other consideration, or two of the other factors that we have to consider, is how complex is the data model? If it's very complex, then maybe a traditional relational database with joins and keys makes sense. If we have a simple data model, well, a NoSQL database might work. The other thing we have to consider is the user base. So NoSQL was designed, again, mainly to process many transactions, lots of data. So these would be applications we have lots of users. Typically, those will be public applications that anybody can go and use. Reverse of that would be something like Blackboard, right? It's a closed system. The college knows how many Blackboard users there are, and that number is not going to double or triple in a matter of months, right? It might, hopefully it goes up over time, but the college controls who has access. We're not going to go from 11,000 Blackboard users to 100,000 Blackboard users in any kind of short period of time. But if we built an application like, I think you saw some of them in the video, let's say you were building a website like Yelp, right? Right, where we had a sudden, or, you know, it was a public application that anybody could use or anybody could sign up for. We were going to market it and encourage people to use it. Maybe we have a mobile interface that connects to the same database. So in that case, we're potentially looking at a massive volume of data, and that could exponentially grow. Then a NoSQL database is probably a really good choice. So there's a number of kind of different articles online that will kind of compare and give you some different scenarios. Actually, Microsoft has a pretty good comparison chart right here about, you know, loose schemas and strict schemas, because we do get, as part of their Azure hosting service, they have both NoSQL databases and relational databases available. So these are the different NoSQL databases that are available. So, you know, and I kind of likened the analogy for Jesse. Really, it's like a builder, right? A builder doesn't use someone who's going to do construction. They don't just use a hammer, right? They've got different tools and they try to use the right tool for the right job. So we now have two kinds of data storage available. It's a question of figuring out, based on the needs of this application, and also how are we building it, right? Is it a waterfall approach? Is it agile? Is it hosted on one server? Is it hosted in the cloud? These are all going to help us pick the right tool for the job. So NoSQL isn't necessarily the proper solution for everything, but it's certainly the proper solution in many cases. So we want to look at the context. It is. Thank you. We're good. Okay, so we have MongoDB running now. So we use MongoDB. So then again, the notes are here. So 27017. So I've documented here. I'm not going to go through all this. It's on the slides. We've already kind of seen the documentation about how we do create, read, update, and delete. We call insert, find, update, or remove. And we pass in some JSON to each of those methods. So I've given you samples here. So what we want to do now is we want to create a new node application, use the Express generator. Everyone knows how to do this. How do I know? Well, because I've marked your labs and everyone did fine on the lab. So if you did fine on the lab and you don't know how to do it, that means you use someone else's lab. And you've already submitted the first part of your portfolio. We did the Express generator in class. You've already done 3 applications using the Express generator. So we're going to use the generator to create a lesson 5 application. And then we're going to talk about this package, NPM package called Mongoose, once we get our lesson 5 set up. So we're going to go and create our 3rd command prompt of the day. Leave the other 2 open. Browse into your node folder. And we're going to use the Express generator, which we installed globally, to create a lesson 5. So we'll run the command express -e. We're using -e so that we're using EJS as our templating and not Jade for our views. Whoops, I need to just go into a different folder. You can run it right from there. I'm just going to go into my Friday folder. So I'll run express -e lesson 5. We're using the generator to scaffold out, build some views, build our roots, create our sample application, our startup app. And then we'll just follow the next 2 instructions. Do cd lesson 5, so enter the new directory that just got built. And we'll run npm install to download all of the dependencies that Express needs. This is going to chug away and install about 15 or 20 npm packages and create the node modules folder. So it installs all this stuff. Oh, it's actually more like 50 packages it installs. So now I could just go to my lesson 5 folder. Here it is. And now we can actually launch this site from the command prompt. So I'm in lesson 5. I can just use nodemon to start it. Someone pointed out this week, I don't even need to put in the name of the file. It knows app.js is the startup file. So I can just use nodemon. And we should be able to load the site. Localhost 3000, there's our Express generator site. So we have 2 root files. We had index, and it also gives us users, which, so this is, the generator builds this stuff for us. So this is kind of like our starting point. I'm just going to make this window a little bit smaller. The next thing I want to do, I want to copy a few of the things we put in our lesson 4 project into this week. We had a header, we had a footer, we downloaded all of the CSS from Bootstrap. So, and we had created, we'd overwritten, so in here, the generator gives us a view called index that looks like this. We're going to want to overwrite that view with our view from last week because the view already included our header and footer. So open up 2 different windows, 2 different directory trees. So on my right side, I've got lesson 5. And on my left side, I'm just going to browse into lesson 4. Most of you were here last week. If you weren't, my files are on Git and you can grab them. So we created 2 projects last week. We want the lesson 4 part 2. That was the one that had Bootstrap and the shared header and shared footer. So let's just copy the public folder because that contains all the style sheets. So I'm going to copy public from my lesson 4, part 2. And I'll overwrite it. So now lesson 5 has all the style sheets we downloaded last week. It'll save us from having to download them and extract them again. So just copy your public folder from lesson 4, part 2 to lesson 5, and you get Bootstrap. Then let's open up the views. We don't need random, we don't need users, we don't need test. We're just going to copy partials and index. So we want the home page we built last week, and we want the partials folder because that includes views to lesson 5 views and replace. Now I can go back. When I refresh my home page, we should get this. So our header loads Bootstrap, which is good. We're getting this error, message is not defined. So I'm now going to open my lesson 5 project up in WebStorm, and we can fix this error, and then we can move on. So open up your code editor.
When I started that basic Express application, for some reason I got my command prompt said get goodbye 404.
Because I think you copied the app.js. You may have copied app.js. Want to copy. So you may want to blow it away and do it again. Open up our lesson 5 in our command prompt. So we're getting an error. I'm going to open up my index.ejs. Line 5's throwing an error. It's trying to display a variable called message, but we're not providing, when we go to our index.js, we're only providing a title variable. We're not providing a message. So we want to fix this. I'm also going to change the title. So instead of saying Express, it says lesson 5. I'm just going to put this on a new line to make my code more readable. Not only are we going to pass it I'm just adding in what you see in blue. Rather than only passing a title to the view, we're also passing a message. This will fix the error that we're getting currently in our browser. The actual text of the message doesn't matter. You can have it say whatever you want. I'll just go back and make sure that fixed it. So now this looks like what we had last week. Now that we're passing it a message, our view will load. I'm also just going to open up my header. We have 3 links in the header: home, users, and random. We only need 2 links. So I'm going to get rid of one of them. Doesn't matter. Just get rid of one or the other. We're going to get rid of one and change the other. Instead of users, oh, we need to have a vote. It's democracy time, boys and girls. Okay. We need to figure out what our little website we're going to build is going to be all about, right? In our PHP class, for those of you who are in my online section, we built a movies database, right? We did pages for doing create, read, update, and delete movies. We uploaded the movie posters. If you were in the in-class section, I think we had a video game. We did a video game library. And if you're in my other section, we did a beer store. So we need to figure out where, if we're building out CRUD over the next few weeks, and then after reading week, we're going to add authentication to it, just like we did with PHP. We'll make the whole thing private, so you have to log in to see any of the data. Let's figure out collectively. So in the class yesterday, they decided they voted for video games. In the Wednesday section, they voted for sports teams. So we need to figure out what we're building. So let's create a quick survey on Blackboard and we'll take a vote. So our question's going to be, what collection will we use for CRUD for our in-class application? And we'll maybe go with 3 choices. Oh, it won't even let me do 3. Okay, we're going to have 4. So I need some suggestions. What would you like to build? Okay. So we could go with booze. Okay. I need 3 more suggestions and then we'll vote. What else could we, what other collection could we do? Okay. What else should any other suggestions what our site could be about? Because we're going to need to build a collection so we can do create, read, update, and delete. So what we pick is going to let us define what that class is going to look like. It won't let me only do 2. I got to do 2 more. What's that, Harsh? You can make a suggestions. Okay.
Ammunition.
Ammunition. Okay. Okay, one more suggestion. Wolfgar? Okay, so like songs or bands, which do you prefer? Okay. All right. Just give me a second and I will make this survey available. So if you're not on Blackboard, please log in. Whoops. And go into your, whoops, I have to make it available. Sorry, you won't see it quite yet. Go into lesson 5 in just a minute. Okay, so if you refresh lesson 5, down at the bottom, you'll see a link that says, what are we building? So go in and pick what you'd like our website to be about. Okay, now I'm probably going to have to stop my stream in a minute because otherwise I think the only way I can get to this is on the page that shows everybody's grades, and I think don't think I'll broadcast that to YouTube. So there may be 4 parts to the video today. Has everybody voted? Make sure you voted once. Because I don't think I can, it doesn't let me pause it, I don't think. Oh, except I could stop my screen sharing. There we go. Okay. So don't worry, nothing will get broadcast to YouTube. So let's see what the results were. And if you weren't in class today, you don't get a vote. Okay. There's the winner. So we will be tracking alcohol. We'll be building a liquor store. Okay. All right. So that's what we're going to build. I can start my screen share back up. Okay, so we're back. Our screen share is back. So now we need to talk about, we've got a database set up and running. We understand kind of the background of what NoSQL is. We have a node application. Now we need to get them to talk to each other. So how do we do this? Mongoose. Okay. There are some different ways, just like when we built a MySQL database and a PHP application, there were some different libraries we could use to get them to talk to each other. We use the PDO library, which is considered the standard. You may have seen code samples with the MySQLi library, which is older, but it still works. So Mongoose is the most popular tool for getting an a node application to talk to MongoDB. It's not the only one, but it's the standard, so we're going to use it. So Mongoose is an object document mapper. It lets us define classes in our node application, automatically interact with a collection of the same name in our MongoDB. It also handles things like the database connections. Database connection string is much simpler than PHP. We call mongoose.connect. We say we're using MongoDB, the server name, then the database name. Now, when we put these on MLab, we'll also add username and password. When we're running locally, MongoDB by default requires no authentication, so we won't have to supply those when we're working locally. And then it lets us create and interact with classes, and it contains the built-in CRUD functions, so we don't have to write our own CRUD methods or write any SQL commands. So if I have a look for Mongoose on NPM, so Mongoose is massively popular, over 1 million downloads in the last 30 days. Okay, and the homepage with all the documentation, mongoosejs.com. So I have my application running here with NodeMon. I'm going to stop it for a minute so that we can install Mongoose. So just go to your last command prompt, the one that's running our node application. We'll hit Control-C just to temporarily stop that application. And we'll run an npm install mongoose. We'll add --save. What does --save do again? Wolfgar? That's right. It adds it to package.json as a dependency with the current version. So we don't need --save, but then it won't be added to it won't be tracked in package.json. It's a good idea. No, because we actually will reference it specifically in our application code. Every time we create a class, we need to make a link to Mongoose. And when we create a connection, we'll link to Mongoose. So theoretically, you could install it globally, but practically, we're better off to actually install it in every specific application. So Mongoose has a bunch of dependencies of its own, which we're going to see. So it installs all of these things. So one of the things it's going to install is a library for parsing Bison data, right? So for doing the converting JSON objects in and out of binary. So now I could use NodeMon to restart my app. So it's back running again. So now that we know what we're going to be building, we can change the user's link. We're not going to have a user's link. So let's think about what do we want to call. Maybe we want to call it drinks. That says drinks. In your header, under views, and partials header, wherever it says users, let's change it to so we'll have a home page and we'll build a drinks view that we can access by clicking the drinks link in our header. If we click it right now, we're going to get 404. That view doesn't exist and there's no routing set up. So our next step, once we've got this link, is we want to connect our application. We need to set up a connection to the database. Now in PHP, the way it's different. PHP applications, we would connect to the database right before we ran a query or an insert, and then we would immediately disconnect. When we use Mongo and Mongoose, it's actually different. The practice is kind of strange. We actually connect right in app.js. As soon as the server starts running, we open a connection and we just leave it open. So let's open up our app.js. It doesn't really matter where we do it. I'm going to do it, create my connection right after we create the Express application. So we'll use Mongoose to connect to Mongo. So we just installed Mongoose with npm install. So now let's link to Mongoose. Once we have a Mongoose object, we can call the connect method of Mongoose. Now, in the sample code that we saw on the documentation, the line is basically mongoose.connect, and then the connection string is MongoDB / our host name / our database name. We could put that right in our app.js. It's probably not a great idea. That connection string is kind of a global variable. I want to make a separate file to hold any global variables. So if we change that file, we don't have to, we're not really monkeying around in app.js. So by convention, you'll see in many Node applications a subfolder called config. So any configuration items go in there. So I'm going to right click my project. I'm going to create a new directory that I will call config, short for configuration. It's created here. And in here, I'm just going to make a small JavaScript file where I'm creating a JSON object with any global variables, and then I export it to make those variables public. So again, this step isn't required. It's just kind of good practice. So in my config directory, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file. I'll call this global vars. Use a different name. By all means, use a different name. Or you could skip this step entirely and just put your connection string in app.js. So I'll use module.exports, which we used last week. That just means to make this thing a public object. And in here, we'll define our connection string. I'm going to create a global variable called DB. And there's the format of our connection string. Much simpler than in PHP, where I made you type it out for 6 weeks before I showed you what an include file was. Okay, well, if we're going to connect our application to a database, what information do we need to know? There's 3 parts to this. What does that tell us? Yeah, what kind of database is it? What does that tell us? Yeah, what's the server? So what would that be? I'll let you answer your own question. What would that be? How many databases could there be on this server? 1 or many? Right? So what does that represent? No, this is the server. So if that's the server and the server has many databases, what does this represent? Right, which specific database this application is connecting to. Make sense? It's really similar, actually, if I can pull it up for a minute. Let me just go to my lesson 4. It's really similar PHP version, right? What type of database? What's the host? What's the database name? So the 3 parameters are actually the same. And then at the end, we have username and password. But the format is easier in Node.
But we're using COMP2068, right?
Yeah, so that's the name. You don't have to use that name, whatever database name you use. So I've got 3 of them. If I go to my data folder and DB, whoops. So there's no data in here yet, so we don't see the Friday. As soon as we insert a record, we'll see it. And we'll seed the database in a minute now that we know what we're putting in there. So there's our connection string. So now in app.js, we're just going to use that DB value, and it refers to the connection string. So let's connect to our So we're going to link to our configuration file, and now we can read the connection string out of that file. We'll call mongoose.connect. And now we just pass in as a parameter config dot, and notice it finds that variable. My code editor now recognizes when I hit config dot, it knows there's a public value there called DB. So that opens a connection to our local MongoDB server to the specific database we specified in our connection string. So NodeMon should restart, which it did. Now, if we notice, as soon as our application loads, it makes that connection to MongoDB. If I go back to my first command window, it just said that it just accepted another connection, and I have 2 connections open now. One from my Node application and one from my other command prompt. So this is all the code we need to connect our application up. Our node can now see that MongoDB, and there's an active connection that we can use for doing create, read, update, delete. We won't see any changes in our application. If I go back to my browser, home loads, drinks will give me a 404 because we haven't set that up. We have a broken link. Who has theirs connected okay? Okay, so about half. If you are not connected, do you have an error? Who has an error? What does the error say?
Saying that the node app
Crash.
Okay, if NodeMon crashed, then something's wrong. So here's this file again. You need a semicolon at the end. Your connection string has to be in quotes. It's a string value. You also need to make sure that you have an equal sign here. So check all your code in this file first. See if you found maybe a typo or something missing. And again, here's app.js. If it's still crashing, you may need to look a little higher up in the trace in command prompt for a specific error message. The error message usually appears right at the top. Failed to connect to server. Is your first command prompt that's running the server still open? Okay, that's why, yeah. If you close this one, so if I close that, if I stop my server. So now if I try to run it with my database, out my database running, now I get failed to connect, right? I've turned it, by closing that first command window, I shut the database server off. I took it offline. So in that case, I go back into my MongoDB folder. Oops. Again, I run the Mongo daemon, MongoD, and again, DB path. Now my server's back on, my database is back online. And I probably have to stop my node application and restart it.
We run that into MongoDB on the other server, on the other command prompt.
Yeah, so the first, yeah. So now both are running again. Now this is one benefit of hosting our database in the cloud on MLab. We don't have to start a local instance of MongoDB. We can just connect to our database running in the cloud on MLab if we want. So you can also try this. We'll do it maybe next week. So if you've created an account on MLab, you can just create a database. You have to create a username and password, and it actually will give you the full connection string to use in here. It's basically the same. It just also includes your username and your password. And you can connect to your MLab database in the cloud instead. It will work. Okay. So what we want to do, we're going to take a break in a minute. I'm going to come back to this diagram. Anybody getting tired of seeing this diagram that I show you every week? Good. You might have to recreate it in a couple of weeks. Or label it or something like that. Okay. So far, right, if you think about what you did for Lab 4, and yes, I learned lots of very interesting things about you. Wolfgar, your family has the coolest first names of any family I've ever seen. Never heard of any of those names, but they're pretty neat. We've done this part, right? We've done the dispatching, we've done we've been doing this part for several weeks now, and the generator makes that really easy, really. So now what we need to add in is the model piece. So that's going to allow us, rather than simply taking a URL and loading a page, we also want, before we load a page, we want to be able to work with data, to interface so our logic can talk to our MongoDB, do create, read, update, and delete, and then send data from either from the view to the controller or from the controller to the view. So the models really, which we're going to be creating, it's really no different than creating classes in Java. Right? So if we're building, we have a drinks collection in our database, we're going to need to define a drinks model with all of the properties and data types. So somebody said to me, asked in class yesterday, well, if MongoDB is schemaless, how do we check that we get proper data or that it's in the proper format? That's part of what the models do. So rather than defining a drink schema in our MongoDB, we'll create a drink model, and that model will define what a drink is in our application. What are the properties? What are the data types? What are the validation rules? So that stuff lives in our application code like it would live in a Java class, but it doesn't have to be defined in the database.
Does this have the ability to import CSV files? Is there a way to do that kind of thing? Like, say you were creating this for a client and they had a huge list of their products.
Great question. Right. So we don't want to re-enter, or we're moving it. Somebody said, what if I want to move data? Hey, I already have a relational database and I want to go to this. How do I do it? Well, this is what MLab looks like. And as I said, you get 500 megs free to have a sandbox. So make sure you have an account for this. So this is what it's going to look like. So here's a database I created last year in this class. So I have 3 collections. Articles collection with a few articles. I could actually add a document here. So if I wanted to add something, I could just put in some JSON. But under here, there should be a tool that have an import and an export. CSV, here you go. Import collection from CSV or export. So it's a command line tool. Here's the command. So you connect to your database and you run Mongo import, your server name, your database name, your username, password, and then a path to your CSV file. Or if you want to export out of here, there you go. Or you can import JSON or binary. So yeah, if you wanted to migrate data, then this is a great way to do it. Okay, it's 9:52. So I'm going to step out for a minute. I'm going to stop my screencast. So what we'll do when we come back, and we'll get this working before we leave today. So we're going to do 3 things. Step 1 is we're going to build a model. So I said this will be simple. It's like defining a class in Java. We'll define a drink class. We'll figure out what the properties are, and we'll define them there. Then we need to add a URL handler. So when the user goes to localhost/drinks, our application knows what to do. So we're going to handle that, and we're going to want to load a view called drinks. So first, that'll just be static. It'll just be an HTML view that has a title in our header and footer. We'll make sure we click the link, we get that page. Then the last thing we'll do is we'll add a query. We'll use Mongoose to run a find, and we'll pass some sample data to the view. So when the drinks view loads, we're actually showing data. So we'll have a full, complete read operation running today. Then next week, we'll start with an add form. Jess, you asked about how to build a form. That'll be step one part one next week. Build an add form that does a create. So then we can save drinks, and then we'll do delete and update. We'll have that all working by the end of next week. Okay, let's take 10 minutes here. I need to step out for a couple minutes.